What's going on, guys? It's your boy Beatsbyash back at it again with another banger of a video, and today we're going to be diving into Meta Mechanics episode number 2, Red Zoro, and why I think this deck still holds up in OP05 and may potentially be the best deck in the meta. But before we get into that, if you want to support the show, you can do so over on Patreon. Link will be in the description. You can gain access to my show notes to follow along with the discussion, as well as a link to a private stream where I will be doing the recordings live for future episodes on the channel. And as well, those people can then ask questions at the end of the discussion, which will be included in the video, which will be uploaded to YouTube for free. Or as well, you can do so via a YouTube membership, which I am currently in the works of getting set up. And lastly, if you're interested in coaching, you can join the Discord. Link is also in the description, and fill out the form in the coaching channel. But without further ado, let's get into the goo. So starting off, if you talk to a lot of high-level players in Magic, in Yu-Gi-Oh!, in Pokemon, one big thing is there are multiple different ways to approach a card game and a meta. Personally, the one that I think I have the most expertise in and have had the most success in the past at major events with is determining what other people are trying to do and figuring out the best counter for it. You can also, just figure out what is the best strategy, and maybe in some situations it's better to just do whatever the best thing is. For example, in the tier 0 boat Asian meta, I think you should just play boat. I think that's just correct every single time. In our situation, I think that my approach is going to reap you a lot higher rewards and greatly increase your chances of success if you get onto this very early on before the meta shifts. And I didn't really see a lot of people, catch on to what I was saying in my first Zoro video. I didn't really see any of the results come up in events that went on directly after, but maybe I'm wrong. If someone saw evidence of what kind of value I gave out in some tournament results, make sure to let me know. And I know in the last Zoro video, I did go pretty in depth. And so there's going to be some things that I may not go over in this video just to not repeat all of that information from the last one. So if there's something that I didn't cover as in depth in this one, feel free to go check out that one from about 3 months ago whenever I played in the Tulsa regional with the Zoro list. But I'm going to do my best to give out new information, and I feel like there's a lot of new interactions in this meta that need to be known. And so that's why I kind of wanted to do this leader next in terms of the series. So when you think about what everyone else is trying to do in this meta and how can we effectively counter it, first of all, you got to take into account that it's essentially a triangle-based meta, being the yellow Enel, purple Luffy, and blue-black Sakazuki. And I touched on that a little bit in the podcast I did with Loading TCG. So I'm not going to go too in-depth on that. But if you look at these 3 decks, there's a couple of things that are a very general consensus across the board with what they're trying to do. And in general, Zoro is very well positioned to beat yellow Enel, yellow Katakuri, red-green Law, and as well purple Luffy. Sakazuki, I think, is going to be the toughest matchup with the way that I play the deck. There are a couple ways you can hedge your bets, but in general, I still think that if we win the die roll, we're going to be slightly favored in that matchup, even though I do think that it's very close to a 50-50 matchup. It's still probably going to be the most difficult one. And when you think about it like that, the metagame is still very diverse because one deck isn't necessarily 15 to 20% better than all other decks. And so that's why you see people at these major events in the game still bringing these tier 2 and tier 3 strategies, and sometimes just going on a undefeated run for like 7 or 8 rounds and getting a top here or there. You can't really itemize the meta in a way where you're building your deck to counter more than like 4 to 5 different strategies, because that's just not the way that the card pool currently works, with it being best of one, with there being no sideboard, and in general, there's not a lot of customization in a lot of decks, especially in these newer decks where, for example, Yellow Enel, you're not playing with nearly as large of a card pool as some of the other strategies like Zoro. And you could say the same thing about Purple Luffy. Because the meta is so diverse, even though Sakazuki may be, the most popular deck at a major event, or, in the top 2 most popular decks, I think that it's completely fine to speculate that you're not going to go against 7 Sakazuki in a row. And in that situation, maybe this isn't the best pick to bring to a major event, but you can still win the matchup. I would just feel more comfortable if I'm going against a wide variety of decks in general, considering for the most part, this deck has a very, very favorable matchup into all of the other top meta decks. But all of the top 3 decks, they have something in common, which is in general, they're trying to play a slow game. Now, Sakazuki could be considered the fastest of those top 3 decks, but still, those decks have some very late game cards and want to get into a late game situation. Even if Sakazuki is able to put more characters on the board in a single turn than something like an Enel or a Purple Luffy, you have cards such as Dracul Mihawk, Borsalino, or even the 10-cost Kaido. So all of those decks, they want to get to the late game, and that really makes them suffer against lower to the ground strategies, which can occupy the board at an exponentially faster rate than they can and can be easily overwhelmed. And a large advantage in that is that the only other area of effect damage outside of 10-cost Purple Kaido would be the black 4-cost Sakazuki. And even that card can only kill 2 characters at one time. And in some situations, that still isn't going to be an efficient enough removal to completely wipe your board. And the other decks don't have anything like that at all, which is a very large incentive to play Red Zoro when you think about what our game plan is and what we're trying to do. And we'll get into what the game plan is a little bit later, but I want to address a couple other reasons to play this strategy. One being the versatility of the deck to be able to willingly want to go first or second. Typically in Zoro, because it doesn't matter so much whether you go first or second yourself, you have the opportunity to steal whatever curve is going to be more beneficial for your opponent. And I think that's very valuable in a best of one game, especially when you lose the die roll, because in the Purple Luffy deck, for example, I think it's a very strong deck, and I don't think that going second is terrible. I do think that there are large advantages associated with going first, and being able to steal first from something like a Purple Luffy is very, very valuable for the Zoro deck. But at the same time, if we lose the die roll, we don't automatically lose the match. And that's something that you can't say about every single deck. So that is just a large advantage in itself, because one concept I always think about when approaching a major event in any game is, how can I build my deck to not be reliant on the die roll? So when I do lose, it doesn't ruin my tournament experience. And that's especially applicable in this game being best of one and the way that the tournament structure is now. I'm pretty confident that there is not any top cut at One Piece regionals or treasure cups going forward in the USA. I'm not 100% sure about that, but I know for the most part that has been true. And in online events, that is 100% true as well, meaning that one loss can really ruin your tournament experience, and 2 losses, you're basically just out of the running, and in a lot of situations, you might as well drop and go do something else. And that's where the die roll can play a large part in your tournament run, and being able to bypass that mini game, you may call it, from the tournament is just a very, very strong advantage. Another reason is that I feel like a lot of people have just forgotten how busted of a card 5-cost Marco is, and as well Buggy. Let's be real. Buggy is fucking bullshit. I mean, I don't even, like, Buggy's just fucking broke. I would be fine if Buggy was banned, not because it's overtly unfair, but because it's just degenerate, and when you're going in someone like Sakazuki, and they're playing Branu, and they're looking at the top 3, sure, you get to put your stuff in the trash, but my guy has 3k power for 1 less cost, and has 2 effects, and has a more versatile searching ability, allows me to see more cards. I can go on all day about how broken this is, but that's a really big advantage of playing the deck, especially with Marco, because there are so many things you want to pop in this meta, such as the 0 power Rebecca, or the Brûlé blocker in the yellow decks, or even brand new. I mean, there's just a lot of things that you want to destroy for like a 0 opportunity cost that are just going to impact your games, except for like Purple Luffy. I guess there's really nothing there that you can pop, but that's already an extremely favorable matchup for us, so we don't really care about that low impact of that ability, because we're probably just going to clap them anyway. Also, Radical Beam is back at 4. I don't think a lot of people have tested what the impact of that is. In the Zoro deck specifically, one of the largest advantages you have is that you are able to minimize the amount of defensive cards you're running in your strategy, because you're able to occupy the board much faster than other players. You're typically going to be the aggressor, and when you open the 1 Rad Beam in set 4 and set 3, it basically just allowed you to make more greedy attacks and invest Dawn and take risks that you really shouldn't be able to do because you had the 1 Rad Beam. And now being able to have 4 copies again, it just adds another layer to the complexity of the late game with this deck. And it also just adds you an additional opportunity cost to discard a Rad Beam off of your Fire Fist, because previously that was just really, really risky to do considering you only had 1 copy. And now you don't care. If there's a value Fire Fist and you have to discard a Rad Beam, it's a value Fire Fist. It's still insane. And lastly, to go more in depth on how everyone's trying to play a slow game, because everyone has these late game drops, and most of these top decks don't have a searcher, or maybe they only have 1 searcher, like a Branu, or some people don't even play the Skypiea searcher, then you're going to be stuck with these cards that are essentially dead in the Zoro matchup. There's just a base amount of cards across all the top decks that are just dead against Zoro. 7-cost Borsalino, 9-cost Mihawk, 9-cost Kaido, 7-cost Polly, 8-cost Katakuri, 7-cost and 10-cost Big Mom. Yeah, if you use your 7-cost Borsalino plus your leader ability to bottom deck a Marco, that sounds like a good exchange of value, because it is. But because I'm developing at such a faster rate than you, that advantage may not make up for the tempo swing that you're losing, because you're foregoing developing the board that turn, and you aren't able to invest any Dawn to attack my previously established characters outside of my Marco. So for the most part, playing one of those high drops is basically just going to lose you the game, because other than 5-cost Marco, killing anything else on our board is not worth the opportunity cost of playing your big game drop. For example, the 9-cost Kaido, that is a really strong card. But if I took away the effect from you to actually kill something, it would not be nearly as good, and is probably like on the lower end of playability. And that's realistically what's going to happen, because we're playing all these 1 and 2 cost characters, and then on top of that, if you kill one of my low-costed characters, that is a searcher, and I already generated a +1 in card advantage off that, how much value are you even getting from something that was supposed to be a +1 in the first place? You know, it's just such a negative exchange of tempo when Zoro is going to be able to race you at a faster pace than any other deck in the game. So in general, your opponent, if they have any brains or if you're anywhere near the top tables, they're not going to be able to use any of those cards in their deck. And that is a very, very large advantage. And that's one of the main reasons I think that this deck is very well positioned in the current meta. Now, I briefly want to address some of the biggest issues with the deck in this meta. The first one being that Whitebeard is still a tougher matchup. I would say that if you lose the die roll and you are going second, that's one of the only matchups where it is kind of dependent on you winning the die roll and also who has more Marcos. If the Whitebeard player goes first and goes Marco on 5, Marco on 7, and you either have 0 Marcos at that time or you only have 1, I mean, you're probably losing that game. But the exact opposite could be said if you're the person who gets to start first and sees more Marcos. So that's one of the biggest issues, but I think a lot of that is mitigated by the pure representation of the other top decks that play very well into the Whitebeard deck. And so for that reason, I feel very comfortable sacrificing that matchup at a major event. And that was actually one of the more important things to be worried about in the previous meta, even though it's still like a 50-50 matchup or slightly favored for who gets to go first. Now, the more relevant issue for the deck is going to be versus Sakazuki. Like I said, you can be slightly favorable in this matchup depending on the circumstances, depending on, you know, what your opponent is playing. But I do think a lot of this will come down to the die roll. And more than anything, I think a lot of people have this misconception that 4-cost Rob Lucci is a complete blowout versus the Zoro deck. And I would argue that you can't be farther from the correct solution with that mindset because, yes, he can pop 2 of our weenies that would be getting in for efficient attacks, but if he kills something like a Buggy and a Nami or a Curly Dedan or an Izo, any combination of searchers, and I also got to draw a card off of their effects, really, he's just going even in card advantage and getting a slight tempo advantage by removing 2 of my game pieces on the board while also developing his own. And in some ways, you could look at that as returning 2 game pieces to the hand, because in that scenario, I'm not losing any resources. I do think that Rob Lucci popping 2 of your guys in the early game is something you want to be doing as the Sakazuki player. But I think that the bigger picture issue and what it really comes down to is how many copies of Hound Blaze the Rob Lucci player draws. And that's what's really been happening in a lot of my games. And it's not even because they can remove our low-costed characters for free. That is also something you would like to do, but really it's just about them being able to combo that with something like a 1-cost Suru to reduce your Marco to 3, and then using your leader attack to reduce Marco to 2, then using Houndblaze to bottom deck the Marco, getting around the ability of Marco to protect himself or recur himself back onto the board, which is something that can be very detrimental to you, because if you go turn 1, 1-drop, turn 2, 2-drop, 1-drop, and then turn 3 Marco, you're always tapping out all of your Dawn to play out 1 threat on the board. And if they're able to remove that threat for only 3 Dawn for the rest of the game, then that is a very strong exchange of tempo. And it's not like Marco got me any search. I mean, it's a little less bad if Marco got to kill something, but typically at that point, unless they have a brand new, you're not really going to be able to pop something. But even if you do, it's still just such a huge loss of tempo, because we want to occupy the board as fast as possible, and we took an entire turn to develop one character, and they removed it on the spot and potentially developed another character, or maybe that Houndblaze created a favorable attack on your leader that you can't block because it's demanding too many resources, or just another character that you have on the field. And this leads me to believe that this circumstance and matchup specifically is one of the only scenarios where you may not want to actually play out your Marco on the first turn that you could do so, because that is a very large opportunity cost to lose all of the tempo you generated on the third turn of the game, kind of allowing your opponent to stabilize in a way. And as well, the times I've lost to Sakazuki typically came down to them having double Houndblaze Rob Lucci in the early portions of the game, and when they see Houndblaze later in the game, or multiple copies later in the game, it still feels like I'm in a strong position to take over the game, because the longer the game goes, I'm going to be demanding more cards from my opponent's hand because I'm going to be pressuring them very early on. And so the cost of using a Houndblaze and doing a 1-for-1 is actually much higher in the latter stages of the game than it is in the early game, because it can stop them from doing something like putting up a crucial blocker, or they may just be so few cards in hand that they really need to discard additional Houndblaze so that they can get access to a counter to protect their character or stop me from killing them by attacking their leader. But in general, I think that the matchup is extremely winnable, and I think that if you play it correctly, you should be slightly favored, especially if you get to go second, because if you're mitigating their ability to use Houndblaze on curve and as well Rob Lucci on curve, they're losing out on a lot of tempo when they would use those cards, and they're really having to forego developing the optimal threat on the board by having to use these cards to interact with our characters. It also becomes more difficult for them to set up the trash in that situation, because then they won't be able to play brand new on their very first turn, which is what they would do to enable their Rob Lucci on their second turn. And past that point, I've probably already developed a board large enough to where they're not going to be removing all of my game pieces with an interaction like that. And so I think I'm willing to just make that sacrifice in one specific matchup if I lose the die roll, in order to have a large set of advantages across the board. Now, I think this is a good time to transition into what our game plan is and what we're trying to accomplish in general with this deck, because I think a lot of people end up feeling like this deck is a lot worse than it actually is, especially starting in OPO3, OPO4, because the Zoro archetype in itself really transformed or evolved into an entirely different game plan than it did in set 1, set 2. Because the removal was not nearly as efficient in set 1 or set 2, a lot of times you could freely swing your characters at their leader and you probably wouldn't be punished, or you wouldn't be as easily and as consistently punished as you are in the current metagame, because removal was not where it is today. And so people really had this connotation associated with the deck where you just put out a Rush Zoro turn 2, start swinging with it, you just attack with all of your guys the first turn that you can. And in OPO1 and OPO2, I would say that that was a very fair assessment of what you were trying to do. But now more than ever, it's very important to have a heavy emphasis on understanding how to effectively and efficiently attack, and understanding what your game plan is so that you can build the deck correctly. Because a lot of people put these game pieces in the deck that really should not be in there, and they're not maximizing what the leader is actually bringing to the table. And so that's why I think a lot of people really undervalued this leader last set and as well in this set, because if you play it incorrectly, or if you even play it suboptimally, you can just auto lose a lot of the times. But if you play the deck perfectly and you're making the correct decision every turn, you're going to see that this deck is very, very strong. And in my opinion, probably the most consistent deck in the game. So the current game plan is we want to be developing 4 to 5 3,000 power bodies by turn 3. And the reason we want to do this is because when we get into a game state with a board like this, now all of our 3k power characters have an opportunity cost to pay 1 Dawn to make a 5k attack, which is demanding 1 card, 1 life, or 1 character from our opponent. And this makes a lot of sense when you think about the rate that you're paying in any other leader in the game to demand resources from your opponent. You're never going to be in the same position to demand as many resources as Zoro as early in the game or at the same level of efficiency that you're paying for it with Zoro. And that is because the average character cost in your deck among cards that are high enough quality for you to actually want to play is going to be drastically higher in any other leader in the game. For example, thinking about Ohm in the Enel deck, let's say the best case scenario, you're at 2 or less life, so then he becomes a 6,000 power character for 4. Now you can pay 1 Dawn to make him attack for 7, demanding 2 resources from your opponent, which is actually a better rate than demanding 1 resource from your opponent with a 3k character in the Zoro deck. But in the Zoro deck, I just paid the same amount of Dawn to develop 3 to 4 3,000 power characters. And now, even if I'm only investing 1 Dawn into each of them, I'm still demanding 4 cards, which is double the amount of cards than their 4 cost 6k. And on top of that, they're not even guaranteed to get to play the 3 cost 5k dog. Obviously, you would like to do that, but you got to see the difference here is, assuming that in a vacuum, my characters hit their searches or don't hit their searches, I'm guaranteed to be able to attack for the same rate every single time, because while some of my characters like Buggy, like Dedan have effects, I'm always going to be able to pay 1 Dawn and get 1 card from my opponent or 1 resource, where in the Enel deck with Ohm, he may not always be 6,000 power and you may not always get the dog. And even in the best case scenario, now he's attacking with his dog demanding 1 resource, his Ohm demands 2, and I'm still demanding 4, assuming all else is equal with my 3,000 power characters. And if you want to, make that debate even farther, well, let's say I also hit all of my searchers. Okay, well now, in the best case scenario for both of us, my exchange of value is so much better than yours. So assuming that you're always going to be on the offensive, if you're developing the board a full turn ahead of the other player, you're always going to be making better and more efficient attacks, and it doesn't really matter if some of your weenies die on the crackback as long as you're able to replenish the board at an exponentially higher rate than the opponent. It's at this point that you should have a general grasp on what our game plan is and why we want to get to that point. So now I'm going to dive into how you can get to that game state, and all of this starts with the Mulligan. One of the things I find most interesting about this archetype is that the Mulligan has no end-all be-all. This is very contrary to other strategies such as the Purple Luffy deck, which I addressed last episode, and from experience I have found that if you do not mulligan for a 4-cost vanilla character on the play with Purple Luffy, you're going to be severely punished by a high amount of loss in tempo. Whereas in the Zoro deck, there's not one card specifically that you need to open in order to fulfill this game plan, considering that most of our cards fulfill the same role, even though they do different things. But in general, there is a priority of cards that you would prefer to see. So in the most ideal dream hand, if you can open up 2 searchers on the play and as well a 5-cost Marco, that would be amazing. Now I also think that it's completely fine to have any combination of two searchers without a Marco, assuming that one of them gets you access to a Marco potentially by turn 3. This could mean either you have a Ezo or you have a Dedan, which could lead to an Ezo, which then leads to the Marco. Playing Marco in most matchups on the first turn that you can do so is a very large swing of tempo, excluding the risk in the Sakazuki matchup, which I previously addressed. Now, there's also one other thing that does come into consideration, which is Buggy is just a severely overpowered card. And so there's going to be some times where if you have Buggy and maybe not everything else is optimal in the hand, it may be correct to still just keep the hand because Buggy is so strong. I mean, if you have multiple Buggy, that might just be an auto keep. I think that you have more merits to do this in certain matchups versus others, such as if they're playing like Red-Green Law, where their leader is Slash and 99% of their characters are also Slash. Those things are something that you should definitely keep in mind. But in general, I can't really say for certain that you should do these things every time because it does coincide with a lot of different variables. And it's just kind of something that to get a higher level of proficiency in, you really have to play the deck and understand why these things occur because there are no absolutes in terms of the mulligan. Now, because we are typically going to be the aggressor, it's usually correct to take the first 2 hits of damage and go down to 3 life before we start defending. If we're attacking for a wide amount of 5k attacks during the mid game, we should be pressuring our opponent enough to where they need to start prioritizing attacking our rested characters versus our health total. Now, the one exception to this rule is that if you're at 4 life and your opponent is hitting you for a 5 or 6,000 power attack, and you know that they will still have 1 additional attack that could hit you for 7 that turn, potentially their leader attack with Katakuri, which is always going to hit for 7, then it's probably correct for you to block the first hit even though you're at 4, just because that way we're only using 1 resource in order to mitigate ourselves from falling below 3 health. One last thing to remember here is that it's important to note how many searchers you have access to in your hand so that you can determine how valuable getting an additional card from your life is going to be to you. There's going to be some situations where maybe you're just extremely far ahead and you can just defend from your hand before you even get to 3 just because you have so many searchers that are essentially paying for that 1k counter that you may be discarding. Now, this leads us into knowing when to attack, which is quite possibly the most important skill to master in order to effectively pilot this deck. This is why going to 3 life is very important. If you forego developing the board in the early game and invest Dawn into your characters to start attacking too early, your opponent can disregard your health total and start clearing your board, which is then going to mitigate your potential to actually replenish the board in an efficient way. For this reason, you would much rather be the player who doesn't rest their characters on the board first in order to extract the most value out of your cards and not run out of resources. In most scenarios, you will only be attacking with characters in the early to mid game if you can challenge a rested character your opponent controls. And especially in the early game, you really don't want to be investing Dawn to be making attacks until you've already occupied all of the character slots on the board. So typically, if you're attacking at that point, it's going to be against maybe your opponent's rested Branu or a value engine like a Jewelry Bonnie, where attacking with my Dedan doesn't require me to invest any Dawn, and I don't even have to invest a Dawn into my leader. So I can just be fully devoted to using all my Dawn for developing the board that turn, but at the same time, if I don't answer my opponent's value engine like a Jewelry Bonnie, they're just going to get another +1 in card advantage next turn. And in general, if you're able to hold off on resting your characters until your opponent rests their characters, and you're able to then use all your weenies to clear their board, it becomes very difficult for your opponent to then punish you on the following turn because there's such a high lack of area of effect damage in the game, and also rush characters that actually have a very good rate to play them on the field. And because of this, when you get to having 4 to 5 characters on the board, the gameplay becomes less focused on developing the board and more focused on how can you distribute your Dawn to make the most efficient attacks as possible. And a lot of the time, that's going to encompass you on turn 4 attaching 1 Dawn to 3 of your 3K guys and 1 to your leader to demand 4 cards from your opponent, and then maybe you save up like 1 or 2 Dawn just to play down another character that occupies the last spot on your board. Once you have the maximum occupancy on the board, there's a really high diminishing rate of return for actually replacing those characters, assuming that your opponent isn't going to be able to answer all of them on the following turn anyway, and you would much rather just hold off putting a new higher threat in the board, excluding sometimes another Marco, and just let your opponent have to waste a crucial attack with their leader or another resource to get rid of all of your guys that you've already extracted a good amount of value from. I hope that gives you a good general grasp on attacking. I know that there's a lot in there, but I don't want to spend too much time on this subject because it is very dependent on what the game state is and what your opponent is also trying to do. As I said, we're trying to counter what the other people are doing, which is not universal to every single game that you play. A good tip is that you want to be as conservative as reasonably possible with resting your characters if you can afford to do so. Sometimes the other guy isn't going to attack you and he's going to try to play a conservative game as well, and at that point then you're just going to have to start attacking with minimal investments on your guys so that you can progress the game, because you're going to be able to replenish the board faster than your opponent anyway, so you might as well start putting them on the back end and force them to start using cards in their hand. Now we're going to move on to the noteworthy cards in the deck, and a lot of these are categorized into engines or packages, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about how you can extract the most value from each individual card or engine in the deck. So starting off, we have our 2K counter package, which is going to be your 4 Brook and your 4 Makino. In general, these cards are the 2K counters with the most agency in the entire game, meaning that these cards have a much higher merit to actually incentivize you for playing them on the battlefield instead of just keeping them in hand as a defensive tool. And that's something that you cannot say about any other deck in the game, as most 2K counters don't have a high enough impact on the board to justify foregoing having a defensive option in hand. And in a best of 1 card game in specific, I think adding additional options for your cards is very, very beneficial when one game loss could just get you out of the tournament. Now, I have experimented with other 2K counters in the past. One of the biggest benefits of this deck is that because we're so aggressive, our deck requires less defensive tools than other decks. So other decks may play like 12 2K counters, but because we're always pressuring our opponent, we can get away with playing less 2Ks and in fact the best 2Ks. In the past, I have experimented with other 2K options such as Otama, and Otama is probably the next best one to play, but in general, this card has a few beneficial interactions with other cards such as your Marco or your Fire Fist, but even when you're able to use Otama to kill something that you normally would not be able to do so, it's still just going to be a -1 in card advantage in the best case scenario, considering you're never going to be able to afford attacking with Otama. And in a aggressive deck especially, you want to minimize the cards in your deck which have little offensive value. With Brook in specific, this card is very important for attacking correctly in the deck. And if I have to choose to keep one of these 2Ks in the hand as a defensive option, I would much rather keep Makino in hand and play Brook on the battlefield. I want you to think about Brook as costing 0 Dawn, because essentially that's what he is doing. Now, normally you wouldn't want to be attacking in the early to mid game with a character until you fully develop the board, because then your opponent can essentially kill that character without investing any resources because of how low the power is. But with Brook, let's say I have a Curly to Dan on the battlefield and I want to be developing my board. Well, if I wanted to attack with that Curly to Dan, I'd have to invest Dawn in order to make it 5k, which then foregoes my opportunity to use that Dawn to develop another character on the board to make my attacks better for the following turn. Well, since Brook is developing a 3k body in itself and allowing us to attack with another character for free, he's essentially adding to our game plan of developing those 4 to 5 characters on the board by turn 3. And even if our opponent ends up killing our Curly to Dan that was boosted by Brook, well, we've replaced that body with another character of the same power interval. So it's not making our attacks any worse for the following turn, which is very beneficial in our strategy. And especially against decks that don't want to take the first damage if they can afford to do so, such as Purple Luffy or Katakuri, I'm perfectly fine playing a 1-drop on turn 1 and then turn 2 going Brook, boosting our leader and playing another 1-drop, as attacking for 7, even if our opponent is incentivized to block that first hit, they probably will not do so because it's demanding too many resources. Now, even in the matchups where they're going to take the first 2 hits, it's still fine to do that because it's contributing to our game plan. Obviously, if you have a better card to play on the board with the same cost, such as like a Buggy or a Haruta, you would probably rather do that in those matchups. But in general, if my hand isn't that good at that point, I'm completely fine making that action. Now, Makino has a smaller window of playability, but I do think that the impact it provides is high enough to justify putting it in the deck. So with Makino, there's going to be 2 main implications. Number 1, if you're able to completely clear your opponent's board and leave them with 1 character or 0 characters, just their leader, and you're going to have 4 or 5 characters on the board, then it's completely fine to boost someone up with a Makino, because in that situation, our opponent isn't going to be able to clear our entire field anyway. So Makino is essentially becoming a scapegoat for the character that would have been killed on the following turn, which really diminishes the amount of punishment that you could be getting from your opponent by just turning all your cards sideways. Because as I noted, there are very few AoEs in the game, and when you put your opponent in a situation like that, they're not going to be able to easily answer your entire board. Now, if they were able to answer your Makino for free because maybe they had like a brand new on the board, then it's probably not worth it to put Makino out there. But in those situations where you do fully clear their board, it's perfectly acceptable. Now, the other opportunity to play her is when you're going to be going for game and you're going to hold this card in your hand until your last attack with a 1-cost character, because it's telegraphing to your opponent that maybe they can counter in a different way than you actually think they should, because they assume you don't have enough Dawn to get to a high enough power interval to actually kill them. So sometimes holding Makino until the last attack on your board, or even double Makino, is completely acceptable to just replace a rested character on your board that's already attacked in order to push for more power than your opponent expects. Next, we have our Searcher package, which encompasses Buggy, Dedan, Izo, and Nami. At this point, I think 16 Searchers is 100% core and necessary to playing the deck. I think being able to access this many Searchers compared to other top decks is such an advantage in this game that you really don't want to lessen that advantage you have over other players. Now, in terms of the amount of targets which are required, I think me and my team have come to the consensus that for all of the Searchers besides Buggy, you need a minimum of 13 targets, as this will ensure that on turn 1, assuming you haven't seen any cards of that card type, you will have an 83% chance to hit. And with Buggy, you want to have a minimum of 7 targets, which gives you a base 59% chance to hit with him on turn 1. And the reason why he's allowed to have almost 50% less targets for his ability is because Buggy is just a good card on his own, which really lowers the opportunity cost of actually missing with him. I like to think about it as if I do hit with Buggy, then that's good, but if we don't hit with Buggy, he is still adding to our core game plan, as we're already running other 1-cost 3k vanillas, and so in the worst case scenario, he's doing exactly what these other cards in my deck were put there to do so, and on top of that, he has an additional ability that is actually quite relevant more often than you would think, meaning that if we don't hit with him, I'm perfectly fine because he is still doing what I'm trying to accomplish with the deck. Now, with the high amount of Searchers in this deck, something I addressed in the previous video is using the high-low card counting method from Blackjack. And essentially what I mean by this is if you have multiple Searchers in your hand, such as a Nami and a Izo, you want to be counting how many cards out of each card type you have seen thus far, including your hand, as well as cards revealed by any of your Searchers, in order to know how many possible targets are there to hit with that Searcher. And when you're keeping track of those numbers, for example, if I have seen 3 Straw Hat Pirates cards, but I have seen 0 Whitebeard Pirates cards, and I have to decide between playing Izo or Nami on the field, I'm more likely going to hit with Izo because there are more potential targets left in the deck for me to find. In the beginning stages of the game, this concept isn't going to be weighted as highly, as the difference between the percentages of which one you are more likely to hit with is not going to be as drastic as it will be in the latter end of the match, where you've actually seen like 50% of your deck, right? And because of that, the order that I personally like to play out the Searchers in the beginning game is starting with Buggy, just because since he has almost 50% less targets than the other Searchers in our deck, whenever you've seen one event, the percentage chance of him being able to hit drastically decreases versus the other Searchers, which have almost 2 times the amount of targets or potentially more, right? So I'd rather start off with my Buggy just so he has the best chance to hit. And on top of that, he's just a very strong card to start out with, as he is very difficult to remove and he has a higher power interval than your other 1-cost Searchers. Now, this isn't a concept that is mandatory to play the deck, but I will say it is very, very relevant, and it's something that you should be working towards as you are learning the deck, because a lot of people don't do this, and then they start feeling like, why am I playing 16 Searchers? It's messing up my deck. I just keep missing with every Searcher. And to those people, I would say, you're just playing the deck incorrectly. I think that playing this amount of Searchers is just too high of an advantage, and you really just need to understand how the pieces work together and how to use them effectively to give yourself the highest chance to hit. And on top of that, I think people really put a high weight on missing one Searcher can lose you the game, considering we have like double the amount of Searchers of the average deck. If we miss on one, that's completely fine. Like if we miss on Buggy or if we miss on Dedan for some reason, okay, well, those guys are still 3,000 power, so there's still just a 1 Dawn investment to attack, so we're not really losing a lot on the opportunity cost, right? And even with Izo or Nami, putting 2 Dawn on someone is somewhat relevant, especially if you have like a Haruta or a Makino making it more efficient. But when you have so many searchers, even if you miss on 1, if you hit with 2 later in the game, then you're making up for that loss in card advantage. So all in all, I just think that, it's more of an advantage than a disadvantage. And while we're on this topic, a lower amount of weight can be put on another concept, which is tracking how many searches which have occurred throughout the game. Because once you have completed 7 searches, unless you miss, I think, 3 or more, then it takes 7 searches to get all the way through the deck. If you miss 3 or more, it becomes 8 total searches. If you're keeping track of how many have happened and you're in the late game with something like a Nami in hand and you know that, okay, I need a Rush Zoro here off of this Nami for it to be worth it for me to play this card, and that would allow me to win the game in this situation. Well, if you know that you have already seen Rush Zoro and you know how many searches you are away from finding that card, then you can just remove all of the randomness behind that search because you know how far you are away to actually getting to that key card that you might need to win the game. Now, the reason I say this has a lesser weight on it is because you're not always going to be able to get through the entire deck in every single matchup, but in some of the slower matchups, something like an Enel where potentially the guy could be staving off Death's Door for a few turns, it's very possible for you to get through the entire deck. So this is more of a concept that you should just be working towards increasing your proficiency at as you play the deck in more and more tournaments. And I think it's just an additional level of skill that you want to add to your arsenal so that you have like a more advantage over other players. As I would argue that this game does have a higher amount of variance versus other top TCGs, partially because it is best of 1. And then in terms of your sequencing for turns, typically it's best to play a searcher if you know exactly what you're trying to find before you commit to any other play that turn. That way you're keeping your options open. Let's say, for example, you have 6 total Dawn and you have an Izo in hand and you also have a Rush Zoro. Well, I would want to play the Izo first because there's a chance I could find a 5-cost Marco, and I know that if I had one in hand, I would prefer to put it on the battlefield this turn. But if I play my Rush Zoro first, and then I play my Izo, I'm just removing the opportunity to actually put the card on the field this turn, even though I actually got to add it to my hand. So it's just something to think about in terms of, your order of sequencing for the turn. And then in terms of attacking, typically if you're going to attack with one character but not the others, you would preferably attack with Dadan, because that way, since the character you attacked with is probably dying on the following turn, you're keeping a 1-cost character on the board, so you're leaving up a window of opportunity for you to get value out of a Makino later in the game. Whereas if Dadan is the one that's left unrested, then you're not going to be able to target anything with Makino sometimes. And that could be the difference between you having enough power in order to go for game or kill a crucial character. And then in terms of defending, typically all of these characters are not going to be worth investing resources from your hand to defend attacks, especially because they're so low power interval that a lot of attacks with, 5,000 power characters or base attacks with the leader are going to demand more than one resource out of your hand. And every resource in your hand that you use for a defensive opportunity takes away from your ability to make an offensive play and replenish the board in a efficient way, which is very important to what we're trying to do. On top of that, there's just a secondary benefit of swinging with your weenies when you know you're trying to replenish the board, because you don't want to replace a character that's rested on the board, even though you really want to search, because then that's just giving you a -1 in card advantage. And also, these characters can be used as a way to get your opponent to not pressure your life total. So when you're already at 3, you don't really want to have to defend your leader because you don't want to go down below that into the danger zone too quickly. So if you can attack with a character and leave it open on your opponent's turn, sometimes you're just going to be forcing them to clear your board so that you don't take a damage. And that's a really big advantage in itself, since you don't want to be defending your leader or your characters that are below 5,000 power unless you really have to. The one exception is if you're going to have game on the following turn by leaving up an additional character on your field, then obviously you're willing to discard as many resources as possible, but that's about the only time that it's really going to be worth investing cards to protect these characters. Moving on to the 1-cost vanilla package, this is going to be your 4 Sunicune and your 2 Sanji. These ratios are interchangeable, so if you have 4 of the Sanji from OPO4 and you only have 2 Sunicune, that is completely fine, as they both have the Straw Hat Pirates keyword. These cards are very integral to the deck because since they only require 1 Dawn to attack and they require only 1 Dawn to be put onto the field, they're going to be your most efficient characters to make attacks with on the board, and you're not really losing a lot if they kill them because they only costed 1 Dawn. And then with your Nami in general, unless you're in the latter portions of the match, these cards are going to be the most common targets for your searching ability that you want to add in the early and mid portions of the game, because you want to be using every single Dawn you have available for the first, 2 to 3, maybe 4 turns to solidify that you're going to develop the board with 5 characters by that turn 3 threshold. Previously, before OPO4, I was just playing for Sunicune, but I felt like the efficiency that 1-cost 3Ks bring to accomplishing our game plan is so high that I decided to add an additional 2 copies. If you wanted to reduce this, I think it is possible, but I just think there are so many advantages to having this roll of characters in the deck, especially in a very slow state of the meta as we are in right now. Next, we have our 4 copies of Haruta, which I classify as virtual card advantage. And what I mean by this is every turn you have this card on the battlefield, it appreciates in value because every turn you're generating a free Dawn that you would have had to invest and forego developing the board in order to make a crucial attack or set up your leader to buff everyone on the board. And after you've gotten this 1 additional Dawn advantage after 3 to 4 turns of it being on the field, that in a lot of cases is going to be worth the same as drawing an additional card. And so that's why I classify this card as being in the role of virtual card advantage, because the value that it's generating on the board eventually becomes equivalent or more beneficial than drawing a card itself. Now, because he has an appreciating value, typically you want to put him on the board as soon as possible, because as the game goes on, he's going to be more easily answered from your opponent's removal. And in the early games, sometimes your opponent, even if they have a removal spell, they're not going to be able to use it on turn 2 because they don't want to sacrifice developing their own board. So the sooner that you get this guy on the board, the better, as the more value he will present. Versus you just playing it on turn 6 and then the other guy just kills it with like a Rob Lucci or any kind of hard removal like that. A good tip is that if you have this card and Brook in hand, typically you would prefer to hold the Brook and just play the Haruta for that reason of him accruing additional value throughout the game. And what I usually tell people in my coachings is that there's a lot of situations in this deck where if you have 2 cards in hand that may have a similar cost and may have a very similar impact on the board, you would rather play the one that has a higher depreciating value over the one that does not. So for example, because we want Haruta to stay on the board longer, we want to play him first. Whereas with Brook, if we need to forego putting one of these on the battlefield this turn, well, one turn later, our Haruta is going to lose value because we lost out on an additional resource we could have generated. But if we played Haruta and hold Brook until next turn, Brook is always giving us 2 Dawn. So his value is going to be constant. And that is very important in terms of knowing how to work through your decision-making process in this deck in general. Now, one of the biggest advantages of this card is that it is very impactful versus 6,000 power leaders, especially during last set and set 3, because against Whitebeard, you're essentially enabling a free attack with your leader during the early portions of the game. Whereas if you don't have this card, then you're more likely to just spend all of your Dawn to develop the board, and then you don't have a Dawn left over to start attacking them for 6,000 power. So it's very important in that aspect, and I would say the more relevant thing that will happen in this meta is versus the purple Luffy deck, because they can boost themselves up with the 7-cost Eustace Captain Kidd, and as well the red-purple Luffy deck for the exact same reason. This card is a good incentive to mulligan in those matchups just to find it, because the games where you have this card are going to be so much easier versus those matchups as you're hedging your bets versus one of their best tools to counter your low-to-the-ground strategy where you want to be swinging for 5s, right? And then also, because we want to have a base amount of 13 minimum search targets for each of our searchers, I would classify Haruta as one of the higher value Whitebeard Pirate types cards in general in terms of its card quality compared to all of the options. And because of that, if you have an E-Zone hand and you already have access to a Marco, then this is the card that you're most likely going to want to find off of that E-Zo during the early and mid portions of the game. And in terms of attacking, when you have this card on the battlefield, if you're not going to be able to swing with all of the characters on your field, Haruta is the one that you are most happy to leave unrested, as if he dies, then we're losing additional value every turn, whereas if they kill Artidan, we lost a 3,000 power character, but we're not losing that additional Dawn that Haruta presents. A good tip when you're on the fence about how you should be attacking is that you want to be as conservative as you reasonably can with your Haruta in terms of attacking in order to get the most value out of the card. Next, I'm going to talk about what I would consider the tech slot or the flex slot of the deck, which I am currently occupying with 2 Rush Zoro. There are a couple options that I will discuss in a moment, but in general, I think that this card is very strong in the current format. It is very good versus slow decks and matchups where you don't need to be playing a tall game. Because of this, it is especially good versus Sakazuki, which is a very board-centric strategy where your opponent is most likely going to have quite a few characters on the board that you want to answer, and you really want to be maximizing your potential to be playing a wide game. Because against decks with higher power interval characters, it's not going to be as worthwhile to play a Rush Zoro from hand and threaten it with an additional attack versus just donning up someone who is already at the same starting power interval as Rush Zoro. Typically, like, the best way you want to play this card is, let's say your opponent has a rested Hina or a rested Rob Lucci, then you can start attacking with your characters on the board for, the base number you need to hit. Let's say Rob Lucci, you need to hit for 6. Well, then you're going to start attacking with each of your weenies on the board, which is then going to demand 1 card from your opponent. And typically in these situations, your opponent is going to be thinking about just letting it die if they feel like they don't have enough counter in hand to make sure it stays alive for the entire turn. They'll just let it die on the first attack. So that's why it's very important to hold the Rush Zoro in hand, because if your opponent has a low amount of cards, let's say they only have like 3 cards in hand, but they're all 2Ks. Well, then if you can attack with your leader and 2 weenies for the base level number, they might just counter out of those because they think that it's really important to untap on their turn with that card alive, but they also don't think that you're willing to invest enough power to actually kill it, and that's where you play the Rush Zoro as your last card you want to use on that turn, and you take them by surprise, and then you generate an additional body, which they weren't expecting. I think it's very similar in terms of its play window to something like Makino, as it's very beneficial when your opponent doesn't have enough characters left on the board in order to clear your entire field. Because if they only have one character, they're not going to be able to kill every single guy. They'll probably prioritize Rush Zoro, and maybe you protect it for one attack, or maybe you don't. But either way, it requires less investment to protect than your other guys. So even if you protect it one time, it's still mitigating their ability to freely remove all of your other weenies like a Buggy or a Dadan, right? Now, I do want to mention with this card, it's very acceptable to play it on the battlefield in the early game if you don't have a good amount of low-costed cards and just not swing with it that turn. And I think a lot of people had trouble with this when transitioning from OPO 2 to OPO 3 and 4, where I said the game plan really changed because in the beginning stages of the game, you were really incentivized to just always attack with this card the first turn you play it. What it really comes down to is if I attack with my Rush Zoro on the first turn it's played, does it present free value for the opponent? The best example I can give is if it's turn 2 on the play against Katakuri, you're going to want to just play this and not attack with it, because if you do, then your opponent is going to be able to attack it for 7,000 with a 1 Dawn investment, and then you're not going to be able to defend it because it requires too many resources. It's just not going to be worth it, and you only got 1 card out of their hand from the attack itself. And then on top of that, if you would have just left it unrested, then your opponent's going to be forced to attack their leader into our leader, giving us our first life, which we want to be taking our first 2 life. So it's giving us a crucial resource that we actually want. And so by leaving it unrested, you're diminishing the value that they get by having a leader that's always base 7,000 power. So on top of having your Rush Zoro die, you're also losing the opportunity to see an additional card at a point in time where you really want to be finding more resources. Now, lastly, I do want to mention that this card is your only other card that is even worth protecting outside of the 5-cost Marco, because it is base 5,000, so it doesn't require an investment to attack on the following turn. So if you're going to use an event to protect a character and it's not Marco, it's definitely going to be Zoro. But make sure that you're not investing too many resources to protect this, because you do replenish the board very quickly, and that attack may not be as important as you think. Just kind of something you're going to have to learn as you play more with the deck. Now I'm going to go over a couple options that I do think are possible to swap out for the Zoro depending on the metagame. So previously, last meta, I played Marshall D. Teach, and I felt like this card was really strong in that meta because versus Whitebeard, where all their characters are 6K and their leader, all of your 5,000 power attackers are going to be taxed an additional Dawn. In those situations, oftentimes you'll just fully occupy the board and your opponent isn't giving you any good attacks, so you don't rest your characters, which means that you're going to have to replace a character in order to continue developing the board. And Marshall D. Teach fixes that issue because he allows us to attack their leader without investing any Dawn, similarly to Marco, almost occupying a slot as additional copies of 5-cost Marco, which is very crucial in that matchup. And then it allows us to remove a rested character that we just invested 1 Dawn into, even though we weren't going to deal a damage with it. That way we can feel good about about playing a new searcher on the board, because instead of losing a card on field, we're actually adding that card to our hand because we got to draw a card with Teach. Now, the main reason I don't think that that card is as good in this meta is because, like I said, there's a base amount of cards that are going to be dead in our opponent's deck on average because their removal is just not worth the cost to kill our small weenies on average. And with Marshall D. Teach, you're just creating another target for them to have a justification to actually play their late game removal and get value from it. So I just don't really like it right now because I want to mitigate the opportunities our opponent has to extract value from the board. Similarly, I feel the same way about 4-cost blocker Marco. This is a card that I previously played one of if you saw the Tulsa regional build, and that was because I just wanted an additional defensive card in the deck that also served as an offensive option. But it just creates another target for our opponent to bottom deck with stuff like Borsellino. There's a lot of ways to get around the effect to recur itself now. And on top of that, with the improved efficiency of our defensive events, with Rad Beam going back to 4, we have less of a desire to have more defensive options in the deck since our card quality did increase in that area. Moving on to our cards that present us a high tempo swing, we have 4 Marco and 3 Vista. The reason why I classify these cards into the same category is because they both allow us to interact with our opponent's board by removing a game piece without having to forego developing the board in that same turn. I think you could play 4 Vista if you want, but I think 3 is a good number at least to have. That way, in the crucial matchups, you have enough to where you can feel comfortable trying to mulligan for it. One thing I think people forget is Marco is still the best card in the deck. Playing this turn 3 allows you to swing for 7 on turn 4 onward without investing Dawn. This card is very similar to Haruta in the way that if it's on the board for 3 turns, it's accruing virtual card advantage, because when we're focusing on heavily developing the board and our opponent is trying to remove as many game pieces as possible, a lot of times we don't have the opportunity to invest resources in a character to make them 7,000. And with Marco's protection, a lot of times he's going to stay on the board for several turns. And after attacking for 7, demanding 2 resources from our opponent for 2 or 3 turns, that's going to be worth at least drawing 1 card, even if you don't kill something on play. Now, I think some people may be hesitant when starting out playing the deck about playing Marco on the field before you have a target to kill, but because he does accrue that appreciating value throughout the game, you should not be worried about holding it in hand to kill something, and should just be focused on playing the card as soon as possible. So make sure you don't think too much about that. On top of that, he is probably worth protecting because of the amount of value that he creates. And if you can confirm that he won't die based on the amount of attacks your opponent will have the entire turn, you should definitely protect him. One of the good advantages of this card is that because we have so many searchers, by the time we play him on the field and our opponent has the opportunity to start attacking him, we will have accrued a lot of resources in hand, which is going to make the opponent think that we're going to have at least one event, even though we may not have revealed one to them, which will make them hesitant about challenging this card on the field, because anytime you can discard a event without paying any Dawn just to protect this, and your opponent had to invest Dawn to make an attack on him, especially when they go above 6,000 power, it's going to be worthwhile. That was one of the things you had to think about during the last meta, was if you have a Rad Beam in hand, is it worth it to discard and protect Marco? A lot of times you still would do it, but considering we have 4, you can be very liberal about discarding those events. And in a lot of ways, The games early on I would lose were because I drew too many events with previous iterations of the deck. Being able to filter out events from your hand without paying the cost is very, very good. Because typically until you're at 10 Dawn, you don't really want to be holding up a Dawn to protect a character or your leader with an event if you don't have to, because it's taking away your potential to maximize repopulating the board. Another thing is, if you have 2 Marcos in hand, it's perfectly acceptable and a lot of times can create a snowball effect for you to play Marco turn 3 and turn 4. Because they are so hard to remove, because your opponent has to invest resources to interact with it, it doesn't matter if you can kill something with the first one or the second one. If you kill their only target with the first one, I'm super excited to play the second one. When you have 2 on the field, that means every turn they're alive, you're demanding 4 resources. And that is very, very good against some strategies such as like Purple Luffy, where the guy is going to put their leader to 6,000 or 7,000. Well, now you have 2 guys on the board that can start attacking their leader without demanding any additional investment, which is just a huge, huge advantage in those matchups where they can put their leader above the 5,000 power line. One last thing you have to think about when protecting this character is because it does require an investment to threaten, most likely, even if you're taking a loss in card advantage to protect it, you're causing your opponent to forego developing the board because they had to invest additional resources into attempting to kill it. Even if they do kill it, they probably won't be developing as big of a board as they normally would. And then they could have also been sending those attacks at your leader, which has less power and would have required more resources for you to protect. So sometimes, even if you know you can't protect it for the turn, it might be more efficient to just discard 1 resource to mitigate the first attack, because you know that if you let it die the first time, they're sending that damage at your leader, and then at that point, you might need to invest 2 resources. So it's going to save you in the long run. Kind of goes back to that thing I said about when you're at 4 life, if they have another 7k attack that can hit in the same turn, you want to just block the first one. It's very similar to that. Now with Vista, I kind of like to think about this as additional copies of Marco, as they're fulfilling that same role, and it's very strong to have, 7 copies of a removal like this, as efficient as it is, in crucial matchups like Red-Green Law or other red decks, where in the mirror match, whoever is able to remove more game pieces from the other person's board without having to invest additional resources is just going to have a huge advantage. And especially versus Red-Green Law, where stopping them from putting 5 characters on the board is just putting yourself in a huge advantage. And then one thing about on-play value in general, at this point in the game, there's just a higher importance on getting your value up front because of that efficient removal. Because if you can kill something with these cards, it feels a lot better if they end up dying, because at least you got something out of that exchange. Like if your Vista kills their brand new, then you feel a lot better about them killing your Vista on the following turn with their 4-cost Rob Lucci. Also, Vista is probably just one of the next best Whitebeard pirate characters in terms of the quota to fulfill that 13 searcher target requirement. And also, Vista is probably right on the edge of being the next highest value card in terms of card quality for your searcher requirement of meeting that 13 target quota. It's right up there with Haruta. In some matchups, it's even better. And in the matchups where Vista isn't actually relevant, well, you don't have any other characters in your deck that really incentivize you more to hold them in hand as a counter than they do to put them on the field. So in those matchups where he's dead, like something as a Purple Luffy, you're perfectly fine to discard this card as a counter because you don't even have that many dedicated slots for that role anyways. Now, I did think about playing Flamenco over Vista at one point, just because I thought maybe it allows you to interact with characters of a higher power interval that you don't normally have access to with your Fire Fist and your Marco, such as, killing their 4-cost 6k Rob Lucci. But once again, it just goes back to my theory about on play value, where in practice, what's actually going to happen is you play your Flamenco and then you got no value up front. So then they just kill it with Rob Lucci before you could even get anything from it. And you just go negative in terms of tempo and exchange of cards. Now, our last set of cards is going to be our event package. Currently, I am playing a 4-1 split of 4 Radical Beam, 1 Guard Point, and then 2 Fire Fist, which means we have 7 events in total for Buggy's quota. I think that the 4-1 split is correct at this point in the game, as it almost ensures that you will see 1 defensive event by the end of the game, and that's typically where you want to be at in this deck before you start getting a depreciating value of seeing too many events, right? And for that reason, when you see more than 1 event, you are more likely to want to discard a card with your Fire Fist. Really, we're not going to be using these cards to defend anyone besides our Marco and sometimes Zoro. And you really don't want to be holding up a Dawn for defensive purposes until you're at that 10 Dawn threshold. I've seen a lot of people make this mistake of playing 13 events so they can guarantee a hit with Buggy. And I just think that's one of the worst things you could do, because in those beginning tournaments I played in, the only way I would lose is that I didn't have enough starting characters in hand to fully develop the board by turn 3 or turn 4. And because of that reason, I just straight up lost, because you don't want to be holding up that much Dawn for defensive purposes. And especially if you don't draw that many characters, then the value that these events actually have just greatly diminishes, because you don't have anybody you actually want to protect on the board. One big thing to note on holding up a Dawn, a lot of times you don't care that you discarded some of your events off of your other effects in the deck, because holding up 1 Dawn is sometimes just better than actually holding up a Dawn and having an event in hand, because with how many cards we're seeing and how many resources we will have in hand, our opponent a lot of the times is just going to assume we have a defensive event in hand, especially now because we have 4 Radical Beam. They're going to be thinking, okay, he has to have at least 1 Radical Beam in hand, and that can stop them from going for game on key turns where you may not actually be able to defend yourself. And so a lot of times bluffing can just put you in a winning situation where otherwise you would just straight up lose. And that's very important to think about. For example, if you could either add an additional Dawn to a 5,000 power character and make him 6, or you could just hold up a Dawn, it might be more worth it to just hold up a Dawn, because putting that guy at 6 doesn't demand an additional card from your opponent as long as they have a 2k counter. So just one thing to be thinking about in your games. I think as you play more, you'll know when to actually do that, but it can prove to be very beneficial. In terms of Fire Fist, a good rule is if you don't know if the exchange of value is going to be worth it or not, if you're killing at least 1 5,000 power character, it's probably worth it, because you're doing 2 things. Number 1, you're removing a dead event in hand that you didn't really want to have until the latter end of the match. And number 2, you're going to be making your attacks better, right? There's going to be some times where you're playing against yellow and you attack their leader, they take the damage and summon a Charlotte Cracker from the trigger. And considering they had to discard a card to put that card on the battlefield, well now, if we're using our Fire Fist to kill it, even though we had to discard a card, we're just going even in terms of cards exchanged versus a -1. So any card they summon from life by discarding a card is more than worth it, even if they don't have a second target to kill, right? And as well, because if we leave them with that cracker, they're going to be able to hit us with a double attack, which at that point in the game, we probably don't want to invest the amount of resources they're going to be demanding to defend our life. But because we don't want to go down to like 1 card in life against their deck, we're almost forced to defend that attack if we leave them with it on the board. Typically, the best situations for you are going to be when you can kill like a 5,000 power character and a blocker on the field. I do think that it is more than worth it to kill 2 blockers regardless of their cost. Let's say they had 2 1-cost blockers on the field. even though we're paying 3 for our Fire Fist to kill their blockers and go even in card advantage, we're losing a Dawn on that interaction, that's completely fine as long as it makes our attacks better. This is the crucial deciding factor of whether the Fire Fist is worth it. It's not about, do I care about keeping this event in hand? It's about, does this Fire Fist make my attacks better this turn, or does it make my opponent's attacks substantially worse on the following turn? Because now maybe they don't have 2 weenies that would have been able to threaten our weenies for free on the following turn. And in those situations, even if it's not a positive in terms of card exchange or Dawn exchange, we are creating a large swing of tempo in our favor. And our opponent might have been playing around that by not having much counter in hand, but feeling safe because of the amount of blockers that they had. Now, one big no-no when you have Fire Fist is if you have to decide between removing their game pieces or developing your own in that turn, you would much rather just develop your own board, because you're most likely going to be able to do the Fire Fist on the following turn. But if you forego putting your game pieces on the board on that turn you Fire Fist, well, the next turn, those guys are not creating new attacks for you. You still have to wait another turn to attack, but the value you get from Fire Fist is always going to be when you play it. You don't have to wait a turn for that. So in some ways, putting the game pieces on the board is just accruing more value. And it goes back to that theory I have about putting whatever on the board first has the higher depreciating value. In general, events overlap across multiple searchers, being your offensive events with your Ezo and Buggy, and defensive with Nami and Buggy. And this is very crucial for allowing us to play as many as 7 events. I know this may sound like a low number for a deck that runs Buggy, but you don't see a lot of decks in general running a high event count. I don't think at this point in the game, events are that beneficial. You see a lot of decks like Blue Doflamingo where they may not play 4 Love Beam anymore, and I think that's probably one of the best events in the entire game. And it's because those cards only have one role to fill in the deck, whereas all of your characters that have a counter have 2 purposes. They can be put on the battlefield, they can be used in hand. Events are even more narrow in their usage for the most part. You're not going to be able to use them until the very end of the game, and they might force you to only use this card during your opponent's turn or only use it during your turn. So it's really a big negative to have a high amount of events in your deck, but because our deck allows us to use events for multiple different purposes, such as discarding with our Marco, adding them off of our searches, or discarding them with our Fire Fist, and lastly, just as a defensive tool. It adds a lot more value to justifying we can put this many events in the deck. And last note on Fire Fist, I want to restate that modifiers in general are not worth much in terms of adding additional value to the deck, even if you could, increase your versatility of using Fire Fist, just because most of the modifiers in the game either give you a -1 in card advantage and or don't present you immediate value on the board, and both of those things are not what you want to be doing. But that's going to wrap it up for today's episode. If you have any questions about this strategy or anything we discussed today, feel free to let me know. I'm going to be hoping to get a gameplay video out for this deck, just like we did with the Purple Luffy one. I feel like using the gameplay as a supplementary product to the discussion video seemed like it was very beneficial to you guys, so hoping to get that done after Christmas. Also, late next week, gonna be recording the next episode over Blue Black Sakazuki with my boy Loading TCG when he gets back from the holidays, so make sure to stay tuned for that. Hope you guys have an amazing Christmas, and all glory to God for allowing us to come together on his son's birthday, Jesus Christ, to be with the people we love and care about most. If you guys got this far in the video, drop hashtag free value down below so I can know who the real ones are, because I'm out here doing it like no one has ever done before. As always, thank you so much for watching, and if it's not the goo, it's got to go. Peace.
Ooh, is that indigo?